If you're a Pittsburgh baseball fan, then this is the podcast for you. Make your way down, grab a beverage, and get ready to talk Pirates with myself, Craig Toth, and Scott Jackson, two of the biggest fans you'll ever meet. This is Bucks in the Basement.
Now I see the changes in this town. They change, they say one thing, but then the next day it's different. They change, but they don't know what they want. All they do is change. Going left, going right, travel day, travel night. That's where we'll go. No excuses, no goodbyes, no one cries, no one lies. We'll never know.
The offseason has started. Well, the Pirates offseason has started. There is still baseball going on, postseason baseball. I have been trying to watch as much of it as I can. Actually, some pretty exciting games, as Scott and I were talking about before we hopped on here. But this is a Pirates podcast. We are going to talk Pirates here. May have some conversations about some teams within the Central. Scott, how you doing today, brother?
I'm good. I'm good. Thanks for asking. I hope everything's good with you. And yeah, there's some exciting baseball going on. It definitely is October, and some surprising teams. Who would have seen the Detroit Tigers coming? And now
Nobody.
we'll see if they can
Nobody.
roll into Cleveland and keep this going. Now that Javi Baez is done, I don't feel so bad about rooting for the Tigers.
Yeah, and here's the thing is I kind of kept the Tigers. I mean, my second team, my cheat team is the White Sox. My wife is from Chicago. I have family that's near Chicago. So if I had an AL team, but once Jimmy Leland went to Detroit, I didn't have as much animosity towards them, I guess. And I just went to visit the new Detroit Stadium, and I shouldn't even say new because it's so old. But the last time I was out there was the old stadium, so I'm kind of dating myself. Beautiful ballpark, good city, good food, and yeah, it's always kind of cool to see those teams just kind of come out of nowhere. Uh, and I think that Pirates fans are hoping that at some point in time, we will be one of those teams. And we see a lot of frustration, as has been the case since pretty much that 10 game slide, at the beginning of August, where everybody is, deep in their feels and is, just kind of, reminiscing about what could have been. But I mean, I'm living in the moment right now. And in the moment, the Pirates made a not so surprising move, Scott, moving on from Andy Haynes, 3 years with the ball club, in the bottom five, in the bottom three for most years in offensive numbers, actually took a step back, this season from last season. Justin Message, bullpen coach, Adam Vish, I believe it was, the strength and conditioning coach. Like I told you before this, I knew we had one, didn't know his name. Can't really see the fault in that with, some of the injuries, that have happened and different stuff and, conditioning throughout the year. Some of guys, dropping off for the last month of the season. But I mean, realistically, the big one here is Haynes. I don't think that we were at all surprised, but I'm not going to speak for you, Scott. What were you thinking when that news broke?
Not surprised at all. Nobody was. People have been calling for it for 2 years. I actually pulled the numbers to see where they stood offensively in these different categories this year. You know, for runs scored, 24th; for hits, 22nd; doubles, 22nd; triples, 22nd; home runs, 25th; RBIs, 21st; walks, 17th; fourth most strikeouts. Uh, There's no surprise that the hitting coach is getting changed. I just wish that it had been done a little bit earlier. Shelton supposedly is a hitting guru around the league. I know that there was talk that he put his foot down. He changed some of the philosophy mid-season, um, but this is a move that is long overdue, and I don't know who they're gonna pluck and put into that position, but it's got to be an improvement over Haynes.
Well,
See,
you're
I've already
speaking of
forgotten his name. I've already forgotten his name.
you already forgot his name, but you also mentioned Hayes, who did not hit well this year. So I think that if you were thinking about bad hitting, I mean that may have been stuck in your mind. And yeah, I mean at this point in time, I mean it wasn't like when Eckstein got fired that Andy Haynes would have been on these lists of people putting stuff out there of we should pluck this guy, we should get this guy. I mean, a lot of times if you look around the league, the hitting coaches and I mean in turns in some ways the pitching coaches aren't very well known. I mean it's not like it's like okay this guy's doing well so you know his name gets talked about a lot. I mean I follow a ton of baseball not just within Pittsburgh, and I could name you the hitting coaches and the pitching coaches for the teams that I follow the most. It's not like if you said who's the Seattle Mariners hitting coach that I could name it off the top of my head, which I can't.
Right.
Um,
Yeah.
so, I mean, to me, I mean, I've always stood by this to a degree is that I don't know if it's Cherington's philosophy, but I do think that Cherington leans towards, the analytical side of things and especially the people around him. That I think this is a very, analytical approach as to, how you can do things. And I've seen other teams, across the league that kind of take this approach. It's just with the Pirates when you don't have it, and I've said this before, that 40 to 45 home run guy or a couple of guys that are these big bombers. This type of approach really kind of seems, as we see with the Pirates, to fall flat on his face. I mean, we have a decent amount of contact hitters here. I know that Rowdy was supposed to be a power hitter. We've always talked about that O'Neill could still develop more power. I believe that he will. Brian Reynolds has shown himself to be right around a, mid-20s home run guy, which is, that's great. But, when you have that many strikeouts, what you're talking about there, and you don't have those guys that can change the game with one swing of the bat, this approach kind of, like I said, it just falls flat on its face because you don't have that instant offense. You have to try to string together hits, and when you have guys striking out, being overly patient at the plate, that's why, like, I mean, Nick Gonzalez ended the year, not with the greatest of numbers, but to me, I saw very situational hitting from him, which, shows promise to me that, things can get better. I obviously would like to see a little bit more power from him, since he showed, a decent amount of power in college. Obviously, those numbers were inflated, from where he was playing. I mean, everybody can go back and look at the stuff, listen to the stuff I did, whatever was written back then. In New Mexico State is basically like playing in Greensboro. You got the elevation playing in New Mexico. You've got, the small field playing in Greensboro. So maybe those numbers were a little bit skewed, and especially as a right-handed hitter, at PNC Park. But yeah, I mean, it's not surprising. I don't think a ton will change, but obviously, I mean, people, can look back to coaches throughout, their career. If you played any sports or whatsoever, you could have one coach tell you the same thing as another coach, but depending on how the message was delivered and how, the drills they may have ran you through or just different things that could have happened, you felt more comfortable and you did better under a different coach's approach. So, I mean, that's kind of where I'm going off of here. And obviously, Andy Haynes, I mean, I will give him credit as he walks out the door for Ono Cruz and his ability to hit lefties in the second half of the season. I will actually, give him a little bit of kudos for, maybe tapping into what Jared Triolo is or could be I still think that's a utility player, but I think he maybe found his footing. But I mean, really, other than that, I mean, there's just way too many, negative check marks against him.
Yeah, yeah, you're right. And with the hitting coach thing, you don't really know too many hitting coaches, unless it's like a Barry Bonds in Miami, if it's a Sean Casey getting hired by the Yankees. In those situations, it's like, well, this guy was a good hitter, so I'm sure that he can rub off on these other players. It's not always the case. And with Haynes, you're right. With O'Neill Cruz doing better against lefties, yeah, kudos to him. Is he part of? I know he and Brian Reynolds are close. Is he part of that consistency for Brian Reynolds? We'll have to see in the future. With Nick Gonzalez, you're right. I will still say that I think that him being more aggressive and going kind of counter to what Haynes preached resulted in his success because he does tend to have some swing and miss. So waiting too late into the count to actually get the bat off his shoulder could be a detriment to him. So I think that the Haynes philosophy isn't necessarily a bad like wait for your pitch, work the count until you get the pitch you want to hit, and then cut loose. But I don't think that this is the right team. I think that that kind of philosophy can work for a more veteran team that has been around. Can work with McCutcheon the way he approaches things. It's not that much different than what Haynes talks about with working, seeing some pitches, getting to your count, then swinging. But when you have young guys that still have a lot of swing and miss and haven't been around the league that long, it's maybe not the right philosophy. And after like you said, 3 years and being at the bottom of the league, it's time for a different approach.
Yeah, and as everybody has talked about, I mean, he is the head of the hitters for not only the team in Pittsburgh but throughout the system. And I mean, holding some accountability for that, just as I mean, I have the minor league news and brews, and I've gone through and looked at who are some of the best hitting teams, and up and down the system, hitters and just teams in general have struggled. I think that Oscar Marine, uh, he to his credit has done well with some pitchers. I mean, obviously what he did with Bailey Falter this year, the faith that he had in Luis Ortiz is kind of why he keeps his job. Obviously, there was some stuff that has not been so great from the pitching at times. So that's why, I mean, before we hopped on here, I think Justin Message, bullpen coach, bullpen bad, bullpen coach gone, and
Yeah,
more of like a sacrificial lamb.
yeah. Symbolic move. When your bullpen costs you as many games as the bullpen cost the Pirates this year, there has to be a move made, and whether it's symbolic or he deserved it, it's a tough business, and sometimes those moves just have to be made.
Yeah, and I think the Justin Message, I think he'll definitely land on his feet. When he was promoted to the Pirates, I kind of looked back at that time. I mean, Stephen Brault had some great words to say about him when he was, promoted to the major leagues. He had been, with the organization for a long time, had been a minor league pitching coach, had been the coordinator of, pitching within the minor leagues, had held those positions. So, I mean, Justin Message, like I said, it kind of, I think that he did more with this team than people realize. Held the assistant coaching position under Searage, and pretty much did the same thing under a different title with this regime. So, I mean, I feel like he's a guy that's going to land on his feet. More than the glorified clipboard holder that some have made him out to be. So I mean, yeah, I mean, I didn't really see it coming, but it's also he's the last guy from the Huntington hires the Huntington regime. So I kind of I remembered he was there. I knew he was there, but then also I remember thinking back to the fact that when everybody else was let go, aside from I believe it was him and Joey Cora,
Mhm.
I was surprised that any of them have lasted this long.
Yeah, exactly. But I think that that has something to do with why the move was made, also, not just symbolic or deserved or whatever. But Charrington, he wasn't a Charrington guy, and so he doesn't have that same kind of attachment that maybe a Haynes did. That he came in with that new regime, and um, yeah, he didn't feel as beholden to him. So make a move.
Speaking of a Cherington guy, Scott, you know who's a Cherington guy? That's Derek Shelton.
Yeah, sure
Derek
is, isn't he?
Shelton, he's a Cherington guy. I Cherington had made those comments, earlier, about a month ago or so, basically saying he expected him to be back. Then comes on this press conference to say, that he will be back. And I think that was the point of this press conference that was held. A very strange press conference where Richie Walsh and Jenna Horner were the ones that were breaking the news while this was going on. I don't even know if you saw this. Like, none of the Pirates beat reporters were tweeting anything while this was actually going on. Jason Mackey, who is, a columnist now, tweeted something else that kind of confirmed what Richie Walsh had put out there. But this was like one of the strangest like press conferences and just situations that I had ever really seen. Because usually, the Pirates beat reporters, all those guys, I mean, are tweeting that, kind of in real time. I mean, obviously, they put the articles out afterwards. But yeah, I mean, basically saying that, he went to management and said, I support this guy. And they said, okay, we'll agree with that. And then making comments about how, they're kind of had that shared accountability moving forward. So, I mean, not too often do you see GMs, and I'm thinking about the word, but like, I don't know if it's like loyal to a coach or what it would be. I mean, Scott, let's just talk about like just the beginning of that type of thing. Like, it's a very weird situation.
Right. Well, if you're Charrington, do you feel like you owe it to Shelton because you haven't given him the players? I mean, this is as somebody who's a coach who's worked their way up through a lifetime of baseball. Shelton finally gets his shot. He becomes a manager, and it's for a team that's in a rebuild. And after 5 years of not being given the best pieces to work with, you decided, "Oh, okay, well, you didn't perform to expectations," and you move on, and that doesn't bode well for your opportunities going forward and getting another shot to manage. Does he feel like, hey, I put this guy in a tough spot, so I owe it to him to maybe give him one more shot? I know that in our conversations, you maybe had a different theory for what's going on.
Yeah, I've been thinking about that a lot, and it's definitely a theory that I have. It's probably one that I don't buy into as much. But here's my thing is I was basically thinking, what if, he keeps Shelton around? So let's just say he fires Shelton. He brings in a brand new manager. The brand new, manager doesn't improve the team. At that point in time, I feel like that he doesn't have, Shelton to hide behind anymore. He brought in a veteran manager. The team that he gave him maybe still wasn't good enough. And at that point in time, Nutting, Travis Williams, whoever it may be, has just had enough and then kind of cleans house. If you hold on to Shelton, and this, as we were talking about before the show came on, is that we had there has to be like some things that have to happen here. Like, if he gives Shelton, I feel like better players. And like you're talking about there, that maybe he didn't give him enough players. Maybe he's giving him the benefit of the doubt of, Hayes being out or whatever it may be. But if they all come back and have good seasons, if he obviously brings in players and they don't have a good season, then he still has that shield. He still has that scapegoat of like, well, you know what? I mean, I gave Shelty these guys, and I hate calling him Shelty. I hate that every reporter and whatever calls him Shelty. Like, it's like your buddies or whatever. And I understand you're on the road with him all the time or whatever. but he's not your buddy. He's a guy that you're interviewing. So when you go and you're like, hey, Shelton did not do what he needed to do, I think we need to try a different direction. I really thought he was the guy, and that could maybe save his job for a little bit longer. I never really saw Cherington when they hired him, and this is another piece, as like this, 5-year window guy. Everybody points back to that 5-year window that Cam Bonifay like spewed out like 20
Mhm.
some years ago. And I know that this is like, across the board, like how long a rebuild should take. Before this, we talked about the Royals being in year 7, the Tigers being in year like 8 or 9, with a retool in the middle of that, to get to this point. I saw like I actually saw, Cherington as a guy that was maybe going to get a little bit longer of a string, whether he deserved it or not.
Mhm.
Just because the way that people talked about this system before he was hired, as to the disarray that this system was in, and then they like knock on the door and go, "It's year 5." Like, why haven't you fixed this system in 5 years? The system was a piece of crap, but you should have like, turned this over so quickly. Do I agree with everything Charrington's done? No. Um, do I think that, I've talked about like the international thing, like, Junior Vizcaino, after 7 years, him being let go. Like, 7 years is a long time. And I'm like, 7 years in the international market is like no time whatsoever. And the first couple years of those, of that wasn't even his players. Those were ones that were signed when they were 14, even though that's illegal to do. They were groomed to be signed by the Pirates. They were with the Pirates in like their camps. Do you know what I mean? So like it's very weird. So for me, like, people, I understand as fans and everything, you have those emotions and different things, but it was just like you go from this system was a piece of crap, this team was a piece of crap, this guy's had 5 years, which I will still say 4.5, because of, and I think that maybe that goes into a little bit with Shelton and Cherington. You know, Cherington looking at Shelton and saying, "Okay, I gave you crap teams, and then you also got screwed on a year,"
Right.
and then Nutting looking at Cherington going, "Well, you didn't have a whole year to even develop minor leaguers or do whatever, so we'll give you that much more." But yeah, man, it's just a I think that it comes down to what I said at the beginning of this, before we jumped on, was that a lot of people saw the other rebuild from the Pirates, quote unquote, work under Huntington, and they assumed that this one would either follow a similar timeline or would be successful. And rebuilds are never guaranteed, and their success, even if it's what it would be. I mean, look at Seattle. Seattle rebuilt last year, looked like a team on the cusp of being, at least a competitor for, you know, a few years at least, if not, 4 or 5 years, and they didn't even make the playoffs this year. So I mean, baseball is hard. Rebuilding is hard, and if you don't have the money to spend, it's even harder.
Yeah, well, look at the Orioles. They're in what, year 6 or so, and they made the playoffs, but they got eliminated in 2 games. And of course, Shelty's job isn't getting any easier. Um, I don't know if you just saw that the Reds announced, or it's being announced that Terry Francona is being hired as the Reds' new manager. That's just breaking right now as we're recording. So a little stiff competition in the managerial role in the Central. But yeah, I see what you're saying with Charrington, and year 5 maybe isn't um, long enough to properly evaluate. But how many general managers get 2 1-1s, and he has 2 that have made the major leagues now? It, Skeens was essentially a finished product when it came to him. He had a few things to tweak and build his arm back up after being abused in at LSU that year. But Henry Davis is going to be, I think, a defining part of Charrington's legacy here in Pittsburgh. But I do think that that Davis was a smart pick because that helped us land Bubba Chandler. I think Bubba Chandler will be the talent that is most remembered out of that draft. He may overshadow Davis in the long run, but Henry has a lot of talent. He's got great work ethic, and I think that he has a lot of ability to make an impact. Just maybe he can benefit from some of these changes that are being made in the organization, and maybe this idea of having the major league hitting coach being the offensive coordinator for the system is just something that maybe they end up changing that. Maybe they end up going to a guy whose job is to oversee all of that, is more traditional way of doing it, and letting the hitting coach just focus on the guys on the roster. Because I understand the wanting to have it cohesive so it makes it a little smoother when you have guys come up from the minors and right into the major leagues. But let's just focus on the guys that are in Pittsburgh. If we want to win now at the major league level, let's maximize the talent we have at the major league level.
Yeah, and I'll get the Francona news in a second because that's going to make me absolutely lose my mind. Is that number one? I mean, it's Haynes was given an assistant this year. He did have an assistant coordinator who should have been helping out more with that. But yeah, I think that I do agree with you that I mean to give a guy who is focusing on winning at the major leagues and is trying to focus on 13 players in the major leagues, the guys that are on the cusp of coming up, and game planning for the pitchers that they're going to face. I mean, I believe that they do have Radley Haddad, who is like that game planning manager, or whatever his title would be, but that's what I basically call him, is like helping the catchers with that. But I do believe that Andy Haynes would have some input on different stuff as well, because you're like trying to look for in the game planning aspect of things, that you're going to face. And I'm going to drive about 15 miles up to New Brighton right now and see if Terry Francona still lives there and tell them what the HE double hockey sticks you're doing going to the Cincinnati Reds. My dear God, it's such a great manager. People were wondering if he was going to come back. I have all the respect in the world for that man and what he's done for the teams that he's managed. The Reds don't deserve him right off the bat. I mean, maybe that's a little bit of a hot take. Um, but yeah, I mean, if anybody is going to help a young team, I would put my cards in that basket for him. And I believe that's probably going to be like the talking points for a lot of the podcasts here and a lot of the papers here moving forward. Is Terry Francona being hired? Because Terry Francona retired. He had some health issues. And it wasn't sure if he was going to come back. It's a name they had, I had heard in whispers and mentioned by people, if Derek Shelton would have been fired. So this right here is just going to be it's just going to be another week of people. I think I said it before, getting into their feels. And I think you told me about that beforehand. I think you put that in my head of getting into their feels, that they're just going to go out and they are going to go nuts on Pirates Twitter right now. I mean, and that's the one thing that is frustrating here is that Derek Shelton, and I'm going to go to this, is Derek Shelton made a quote that people like basically said, it's like, we are winning more games, we're just not winning enough. And they put the records from last year into the records from this year. That's hot take garbage is what people are doing, is that they are winning more games than they did. They improved by 14 games from the previous season. They went from 200 loss seasons to 276 win seasons. So they do have more wins. Do I think it's enough to get them over the top? No, I'm not sure. But it is also kind of weird that, we're at this place when we have a team that, isn't that far away from 500. Do you know what I mean? Like, I feel like that we're reacting like a team that, had a season like the White Sox or like the Angels. I know that, if you don't make the playoffs, it's still kind of the same feelings, but I think it's more of the expectations that people set up in their own heads as to like what should happen with a rebuild. and just living off of that. But yeah, I'm still like thrown aback by Francona going to Cincinnati because there's Cincinnati is probably the team that I hate most in the NL Central and probably always will. The Cubs I hate a little bit, but I always kind of felt bad for them because they were, the cellar dwellers with us for a little bit. The Cardinals I do hate, but I always felt like we had more of that rivalry with Cincinnati. So yeah, that's a tough one to take.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. It You just don't know what was going on there because Cleveland doesn't exactly seem like the situation that you would just walk away from if you had more in the tank. But I know he's getting up there, and he said health issues, and it's interesting that he would not only come back but go to the Reds. But then, like you're saying with Shelton saying winning more games, think about where the position the team's going to be in would be in if Bednar didn't struggle the way that he did this year. And I think that that's getting lost. People are just focusing on the record is the same as it was last year, not looking at the bullpen woes. Bednar had 8 losses this year. If he's more locked down, if he's more of the Bednar that we're used to, that changes the whole world for the team and really change the team's and the fans' perspective of things going into this year. Something that Cherington said in the press conference was, about the trying to get better and talking about how this is the deepest team that he's had. And I think when we objectively look at it, not get our feelings hurt about how the season ended in the last couple of months, you look at that's a true statement. That you think about the talent that is on this major league roster is better than we have seen. The pitching, when you look at the starting rotation, how strong that's going to be going into next year if you can keep those guys healthy with Skeens and Jones and Keller and Ortiz having a strong outing despite some bumps. Falter performing well as a fifth starter lefty, and then the guys that are on the cusp. So that's a strong building block. The offense started to come around a little bit more. Think of guys like Nick Gonzalez that emerged, and hopefully we'll have a breakout season next year. Hayes was hurt, but we know what he has in him if he can stay healthy and manage that back properly. And like you said, you got IKF and Triolo as utility players going into this season. A few holes that need to be figured out, but the roster is improving. Nick York, that was I think an under the radar at the moment trade that Charrington made that I think is going to pay dividends in the future. So going forward, and it's easy as a Pirates fan to be optimistic for the next year. It's something that we've been doing for how long? But I really do think that things are trending in the right direction, and that's part of why I don't think my feelings would have been hurt if Sheldon had been fired because the the talent is being built. Is there maybe a different face, a different change of scenery in the clubhouse that needs to be made to get more out of these guys? And maybe Shelton is the guy that can do it. Maybe he has it in him. Maybe familiarity with these players can bring out the best in them. We just don't know. But going forward into next year, I think that a winning season and with the expanded playoffs, and you see some of these teams that made the playoffs, it's not out of reach, and you're right, we're not the White Sox. We're not having seasons like a lot of these teams, the Angels and, the Nationals, the Marlins are a mess. We're not in those situations anymore. We are trending up, and the future can be bright.
And it all depends on like this off season here, and people have even said it, and it doesn't need to be said anymore. Is it's a very pivotal off season as to making those additions, filling those holes. The one thing that Charrington, I mean, he does use a lot of the word salad as everybody talks about. That he talks of in like these circles because he's a businessman. He's like a lawyer. All these guys are lawyers. Is what people don't understand is a lot of these GMs and these people that get into baseball are guys that got into law and they got into sports law, they got into whatever law, and they are and they basically that's how they speak. Like they're not going to reveal their hand too much. They are going to speak in circles and times. Um, But when Cherington, like, he gives us these little nuggets that I think we need to pay attention to. So when he speaks, he, basically, during the off season, without, being prompted to, had mentioned Bailey Falter's name, multiple times. And then Bailey Falter becomes, a pivotal part of this season. I mean, it could have worked out, it could have not worked out, but he's basically telling you, we're looking towards Bailey Falter. He's said before, we're looking to make these types of trades, and then he makes those types of trades. We're looking to make these types of acquisitions. He makes those types of acquisitions. So for me, when he speaks so much now of like within the last couple of weeks, basically saying, and mentioning like this offseason, and I mean, he does mention trades. He does mention free agency a little bit, but he mentions trades, internal development, and international development more than he mentions that. So I would think that, he would be looking more towards making trades to improve this team, in the offseason, which people would basically say, well, then do it. And they'll also say, well, then there's free agents out there and we don't have to give up stuff. But then in the same breath, I mean, people will look back to how we acquired, like AJ Burnett and thinking about like, making those types of trades. And like you're saying, like acquiring a Nick York, hopefully acquiring IKF in a utility position, I think is a little bit of an under the radar move. Acquiring Bailey Falter, for Rodolfo Castro, those types of, moves that they make can pay dividends for this team. So I'm starting to think that, everybody's going to be looking to see who the Pirates sign. And I'm starting to think that, we should be looking to see, who could be trade targets.
Yeah, yeah, that's a good way to look at it. You're right. You got to follow the breadcrumbs when he drops them because he doesn't drop them very often. And this whole organization is so tight-lipped, and we saw that with Huntington. Nothing ever got leaked out of the front office. We got to be used to that. I get shocked when I am looking at MLB trade rumors and they talk about an owner doing like a fan podcast or something like that. Couldn't imagine us interviewing Bob Nutting or Cherington actually getting anything of substance out of those guys. But in some organizations, they're just run differently. And I think that that's just Charrington's mindset is this: we have a plan, we're going to stick to the plan. It's a hyper focused. We know what we're going to do. We don't want to get emotions involved because what was one of the last nails in the coffin for Huntington was, they go on a winning streak. They think that they're in play for the playoffs. They really weren't. They didn't have the team, and they give up the farm for Chris Archer. Ends up being, something that we're ridiculed for. Overly done, I think. Of course, as you see how things turned out. But yeah, that's you don't want to get your emotions involved when you're in that position, and he doesn't. But it can be very fans can be critical of him because of it.
I don't know. You guys heard it here first. Ben Cherington, come on, Bucks in the Basement, and we will title the episode "Word Salad." I'm still trying to get over the Francona stuff. I don't know if I'm gonna be able to get it over tonight. That to me, just like I said, it just blows my mind.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely, and it's going to make things more difficult because if there's anybody that can get the most out of a young team like that, it's Tito, and it makes the hill that the Pirates have to climb that much